So, hello everyone. My name is Dermot. I am an investment risk analyst by trade and a member of the Independent Scientific Advocacy Group, or ISAG. It's a lot easier to say. And this is our latest installment of COVIDiscussions, our series of conversations about COVID, about its impact on our lives. Not so much about the science and the health aspect of it, but more the kind of the day-to-day experience of being Irish in COVID times. That said, today we are kind of talking about science, but in a more general way. And what is science? What is an expert? And where does trust in expertise and science come from? And with that goal, I am joined by Shane Bergin, who is a physicist by training, but also an assistant professor in science education in UCD School of Education. So he's the perfect person to be talking to about this, and I'm sure he will have answers to all of our questions today. Isn't that right, Shane?
No pressure at all, Dermot. What an introduction.
It went off perfectly. I'm happy. So Shane wrote an article with Professor Maria Baghramian from also of UCD, my alma mater as well. If you had gone to Trinity, you wouldn't have been invited on this call. But I just wanted to give a background to the article and read a few excerpts from it just to set the context so people know what we're talking about. He started by describing the trust and that cohesion that existed in Ireland back in March and April as we were heading into and working through the first lockdown. And then you contrasted that with the more complex, less harmonious environment of the last 3 to 4 months. I'll just read a few sections from it to set context, but without getting the attention of the Irish Times high-priced lawyers. So
all two of them.
And not so high-priced, they'll probably tell you. So understandably, for some people whose lives or livelihoods were adversely affected by COVID-19, they view the prospect of further restrictions as crippling. Others rightly felt the disproportionate effect COVID-19 was having on socio-economically deprived communities was evidence that we were not all in this together. The complexities of where we are now have produced a climate of mistrust. Many have become cynical as they try to figure out the real motivations of politicians or experts informing them. How are we to address the rising tide of suspicion and distrust? A message of experts know best is unhelpful on its own. What we need is not just trust in experts or even the government, but the creation of a climate of justified trust that will guide us through the pandemic and perhaps through other challenges that face us. So, in your article, I guess there's only so much you can fit into a 1,000-word article in the Irish Times, and only so much you may want to say in that format. So I thought it'd be great if you had an opportunity to maybe elaborate on that article, give us more context, and maybe include some of the things that you would have liked to have said, but you were confined for space or whatnot.
Yeah, I suppose when I wrote that almost a month ago, things have moved on as they do so rapidly in the new normal, whatever we're in now. I wrote this because I could see that experts were starting to become the enemy, or they were starting to become a group to whom many were suspicious of. This is nothing new. We've seen that in very complex environments, such as say Brexit, people can say, oh, well, one expert said A, another expert said B. So look, to hell with a lot of you. If you can't agree, you must all be wrong. And I'll just do what I feel is best. And perhaps if you think expertise is about the end result, it's about the facts that those experts give you, then you would be very wise to say, well, there's contradiction there. So if there's contradiction, I'm just going to do my own thing. And I think for me, that was quite concerning because a lot of the debate was happening about what the experts were saying and not also how those experts arrived at those views. And so by being transparent about how experts form opinions and the basis for which the basis in which they do that. In other words, do they do it on their own, or do they do it in a collective? Is there some sense of peer review within those expert groups, etc.? Where are the limits of expertise? So I'm a physicist. What would you say if I started talking about the merits of epidemiology? You'd probably say, well, like, he's overstepping the mark there, you know? So what I'm getting at is that the process behind expertise wasn't, in my mind, being sufficiently discussed. And if you don't discuss the process, it is harder for us to trust the end result. I think that there needs to be an awful lot more scrutiny given by each of us as citizens to the process that's informing all expert opinions, and indeed our own opinions. So I also say in that article that each of us has a responsibility to mind our behavior. You know, we can go online and very quickly kind of get caught up in something, or be in a WhatsApp group and get caught up in something, and that we're not being careful about our language. And I think at the moment we need to be careful because, well, firstly, we don't want to upset friends or family. And for some people, they're really going through hard times at the moment. For others, COVID hasn't been that bad. You know, like, I put my hand up and saying, beyond not being able to see my family and loved ones, I'm working at home on my full salary. So, like, my view of COVID is very different to my neighbor, who maybe is sitting in his or her house since March and hasn't earned anything except the unemployment benefit that they've received. So I suppose all of these things have to be taken into account. One thing that I've developed in my thinking since writing that article is the rhetoric around COVID. So I'm uncomfortable with the war rhetoric around COVID because I think it runs out of steam very quickly, and it requires an enemy, which the only enemy I see here is the virus, right? I don't see, people who have a different view to me as an enemy. I see them as having a different view. And if I'm able to think about why their view is their view, it can help, right? Because we all see the world in slightly different ways, and that's not awful. So the requirement for an enemy, but also for victory in a war, you must destroy an enemy. So imagine if the end of COVID, that, there's going to be the sense of the victorious, and that their victory will be built upon breaking other groups in society. I think that is an awful route to go down. I think if it set bad precedent for us when we have to tackle other, perhaps more challenging socio-scientific issues, such as the biodiversity challenge or climate change, which hasn't gone away. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense as to kind of what was informing the article and some of the thinking that's gone on since then. I suppose one other thing I'd say is that the nature of trust itself is something that I'm interested in, and I work on it, as you said, with some philosophers in UCD. Trust is not just about giving people all of your information. Trust is a far more complex thing than that. Essential to trust are two things that I feel are often missing. One is benevolence, as in, is the person who's being trusted, are they seen to have hidden agendas or not? Or are they doing it for what you see as very sort of altruistic reasons? So, we won't trust the salesperson who's coming around necessarily because they're like, well, they're trying to make money. Nothing wrong with that, but that might be their real motivation here, not whether or not I should take this insurance policy. The second thing is that there is a leap of faith. So in order for you to trust somebody, you have to let go. And for you who has to do the trusting, you have to let go and trust that someone else has your best interests at heart. But then for those who are trusted, there is a responsibility to act ethically with that leap of faith. And for you to be transparent, for you to have internal checks about how you use or indeed abuse that power. So there are things I think we're not talking about when it comes to COVID-19. We've set up this perfect war rhetoric where it's now the government versus NEFIT. I think that with business on perhaps another side of that as well, and they're all seem to be in competition with each other. At certain points, one group is winning over the other, and that seems to sort of correlate with whether we're in a restricted lockdown or not.
One thing that struck me, actually, I'll make a quick point just on war, because war, it always strikes me how much, I think this is an area I don't want to go too far in, I'm just going to mention it, but how much Anglo-Saxon cultures frame their challenges and their problems as wars, war on drugs, war on terror, war whatever. This kind of battle, and it's, when you look at the history of their countries and their cultures, kind of understandable. However, as an Irish person, I find that that's one of the, to outsiders all over the world, Irish and English people are probably quite similar, and in truth, we probably are. But, when we get to know each other, there are differences there. And one of the things that always struck me was the battle rhetoric, that everything was a battle to be won and lost. And that's something I try to step away from. However, what I do find from that perspective, if you like, that does carry over, is that if you think of a war to me is a kind of national emergency. And COVID-19 is a national emergency. And the thing that I think does translate is the sense that it is something that needs an all of society response. It is the kind of things where we need to be unified. We need to mobilize every resource we have, whether it's a physical resource or a social community resources, where we all need to be united and pointed in the same direction. And so while I agree, and I deliberately try to avoid saying it's a wartime footing or using any kind of war rhetoric at all, but to talk about it more now in terms of national emergency. Because when it's a national emergency, and it is a national emergency, it may not be an emergency for, like you're saying, you may not feel like you personally are in an emergency. There may be people who are not, who are living their lives mostly normally. But for the nation as a whole, this is absolutely, it is an emergency. And it's,
it is.
Maybe,
and we'll notice that when it's gone. We absolutely will. The one thing I'd say is, though, I'm not sure if it's Anglo-Saxon. I think it might be more rather neoliberal, or indeed quite masculine. So if you look at countries where COVID has had less impact, a lot of that has been due to geography, but it's not been exclusively due to geography. It can be loosely associated with leadership styles. Look at places like New Zealand, where Jacinda Ardern is famously chummy with their chief epidemiologist. They've clearly worked in a consensus model where stepping back from previously held views is not seen as a point of weakness, but rather is seen as a strength, because you're being won over by argument as opposed to losing ground. In other words, ego is less of an issue.
Yeah. To go a bit of a tangent, actually, sorry, back on the war thing, I guess I'm most influenced by the US and the UK, and that's where my opinion on that was coming from. But I don't know, maybe it's the same in Europe. I mean, European nations have their own imperial histories as well. So perhaps, and I'm less familiar with what they have, their media. I get US and UK media pumped in, so maybe that's where my perspective is coming from. And and maybe you're right. There are other aspects on that vocabulary and that narrative. I think one of the points you made before about transparency and how transparency relates to trust. And it's something that I suppose my background is in finance. And one of the things that struck me immediately was how NEFIT seemed to match perfectly with a central bank. They seem to they have the same functions. You had this group of technocrats who were in charge of managing this variable. In NEFIT's case, it's restrictions, but in the central bank, it's interest rates to manage inflation. So interest rates are the tool, inflation's the target. And then you had restrictions as the tool and confirmed cases as the target. The thing about central banks is that there's a lot more transparency. There are extensive meeting minutes. We know exactly who these people are. We know how they were selected. There are schedules for everything. So the transparency that's there, because they are unelected technocrats, and there will be unelected technocrats somewhere in your system. So that on its own isn't a problem. But it's that we don't have the ability as civilians to inspect that, to check over it. And when we look at, I've had a particular beef, and I know some politicians have as well, with the speed at which the meeting minutes come out, the quality, the comprehensiveness of those meeting minutes. And it's difficult to genuinely trust what these people are saying when we have so little oversight over what they're doing. And I think transparency and openness is something that Ireland seems to have struggled with for such a long time in many different areas. And it's not something we're used to. It's not something we're comfortable with. However, I wonder whether our generation, we're only a few years apart, we kind of grew up with the internet, where open source. You know, we're like an open source generation where we're used to, on the one hand, you can say we're these entitled millennials who are used to everything being free. On the other hand, we're also used to just putting everything out there, putting it out there in GitHub and wherever else, putting all the information, the reasoning, the logic behind everything out there. And by doing that, on the one hand, we can be more, we're open, we're transparent, and people can trust more, but also we can learn, like you were saying before, about having a culture where you're okay making mistakes, because making mistakes isn't a weakness. The ability to learn from your mistakes is the ultimate thing, isn't it? I mean, that's, you know, if you can do that, you can do anything. Yeah,
that's interesting. I think that's interesting about this idea of the comparison. Like, you know, and you can certainly see from your worldview how the comparison between the central bank and NEFIT is one that makes a lot of sense. I am struck, however, that bankers and politicians are consistently ranked as amongst the most least trustworthy professional groups, despite the fact that both of them have very high levels of transparency in how they work. Whereas medics and scientists are often cited as amongst the most trustworthy, yet to the public, they're not that transparent. So it makes me think of Onora O'Neill's work. She's a member of the House of Lords in the UK. She's a philosopher. And she talks about the importance of transparency, but she says it has to be sort of more than transparency. There has to be that sense of benevolence that goes with it. So in other words, when you look at Tony Holohan on the news at 6 o'clock, is he someone who you feel is working in your best interest or not? And that's a very hard thing to quantify. And what it can come down to is the experience that a person like him has for his job, his level of training, I suppose the amount of openness, as you said, is incredibly important too. So that I think you're right though. I think that we could do a lot more. I think just because you have this bunch of scientists and medics in a room and they're called NEFIT and they're they're not making decisions, they're making recommendations to government. I get the sense that they, perhaps, this is just my view, they would like to be more transparent than they actually are. It's the big question for me is, where's that information going? And how are they being transparent with it? So it's being fed into now another committee of civil servants who's headed by Martin Fraser, and then is going to cabinet. And that's where the secrecy, in my mind, comes in, because this is where all of the other interest groups start to feed into it. And our politicians, and this is their job, they have to weigh up all of the views that are coming in. And they can be from lobbyists who are completely entitled to lobby. But, you know, I suppose that politicians are so used to information coming in that way that they're probably highly tuned to those well-oiled lobby groups. But I don't know about you, in the last few days, I kept thinking, like, where are the lobbyists for people who live in nursing homes or for, you know, those who are perhaps living on their own? There's no IBEC for them. It's not to say IBEC is acting inappropriately. IBEC are doing exactly perhaps what IBEC feel they should be doing. You know, we could talk about whether their short-term view is appropriate or not, but they're representing their interests. So I suppose politicians have to try and balance all of those things. And I wonder if they were more upfront about how their process works, would we be more trusting of them? The recent debacle with the appointment or the process for appointing a member of the Supreme Court is a perfect example of that. So, you know, what we're all hung up on here is that we don't really trust the process that they're telling us they used, you know. Well, certainly I am.
Yeah, and I wonder whether there's an element of political, understandable, but maybe not desirable, political expediency in that there's the long-term problem, and then there's the problem that you can manage within the term of your, you know, whatever position you're in, until you're up for like the higher one. You know what I mean? And it's like, well, I can manage the long-term, try and solve the long-term problem, or I can manage the short-term problem until I've got my next promotion, which is not a topic that we're going to solve, I don't think. As it
no, but
like
it is COVID relevant, isn't it? Like, you know, you and I both would advocate for a more zero COVID approach, which requires more medium-term thinking, right? It's basically saying, is our current relaxation warranted based on the fact that, you know, we're more than likely going to have another period of restriction? You did mention moments ago about NEFIT's tool is restrictions. I suppose their only tool at the moment is restrictions. It doesn't have to be though, right? Like, you know, there are so many other things that they have been recommending that that policy hasn't followed up on. So an effective track and trace mechanism, better control of our borders, perhaps a more zoned approach to how we implement restrictions, etc. I think, you know, as my fiance says, when you're a carpenter, your only tools are a hammer and a saw, and so every problem is going to be solved with a hammer and a saw. So I think politicians are just used to that. I'm perhaps just disappointed that they haven't used the cover that NEFIT would have given them to make more medium-term decisions about COVID-19. You know, to basically say, look, there's nothing much we can do here, that we're looking to protect businesses in the long term and protect lives as well in the long term. And so we're going to have to try and get our numbers down to somewhere where test and trace will actually work.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with that, and I think this relates to the general topic of trust as well, and particularly in this case with NEFIT, is that because NEFIT is basically medics, Department of Health, with the EAG as well, you know, consultants, professors, etc. It's all just one perspective, and I think because of that, the government feels a responsibility to fill in the gaps, whereas the WHO had recommended from way back in early February, this is not a job for departments, you know, health ministries alone. It needs an all of society response. And they advise specifically that top level management cell, the national emergency cell, whatever it is, that it should be representative of all of government and all of society. And it should be diverse. And I totally agree with that. And I think that if it had been more representative, if you had a national cell that was, of course, public health people, but people who understand, or people who have perspective on or an expertise in legal aspects of this, economic stuff, industry bodies, community representatives, the guards, the army. Once you had the entire kind of society there, I think there would have been, well, firstly, I think it would have been more legitimate. I think everybody would have been able to say, okay, we can kind of trust what these guys are doing. They could still get it was always going to rely heavily on public health officials. You know, they were always going to be kind of leading it, but you can still have, you know, a group of like 20, 30, 40 people, with people from business and people from academia and, you know, whatnot, would then, you know, feeding into it would be the expert advisory groups on legal issues, on public health, yada, yada. And I think if it had felt a bit more representative to everyone, in the same way that, you know, more transparency helps us to trust this group more. And I think then it would have been, the people would have trusted it more. And I also think it would have come up with better recommendations as well. And it would have been easier for the government, I think, to manage them, as you were describing about.
Yeah, I agree. And like, you know, maybe this comes back to like trust and that war rhetoric I mentioned a moment ago. It's like just the other day, we heard talk about the so-called battle of the spreadsheets, where EY were compiling data that was being used by government, as they said, to balance the expert view from NEFIT. And I certainly got the sense that there was a tug of war between these two things. And I tweeted to say, would it not have been better for there to be some high level meeting between them, or perhaps, as you hinted at, that there'd be more of a sort of like a whole of government approach, such that they could reach consensus, and then, you know, from that speak with more legitimacy, because I would have trusted that more as a citizen, rather than, you know, the one side has won this month, but next month maybe my side will win, you know, and kind of we're pulling between these two extremes. Yeah, I suppose when it's all over, from an academic point of view, it'll be interesting to see how other societies have handled this, and I'm sure much will be written on it. But of course, that's only of interest to an academic right now. What people want to know is what can happen between now and when COVID is a memory. Like, there's still a long way to go, you know, and I'm concerned that this way of operating, this sort of your facts versus my facts approach, is only going to get tenser and tenser. And it'll become particularly tense, I fear, when there are vaccines available and we're trying to decide who should get them, and to sort of be above suspicion for the kind of, well, I know of TD, and or I know a doctor, and should they sorted me out and I got it first. And then, that if that happens, I think we really would be in a tough spot. But we need to trust the process of vaccination when it comes, and we also need to be able to trust the science and the expertise that's informing the vaccine itself, so that we're able to reduce the amount of vaccine hesitancy, and to comfort people who may have legitimate doubts, and for the media to perhaps be more mindful of how they handle the egregious doubters who are just trying to cause dissent. And we've seen other groups kind of use COVID for their own political purposes in recent months, where a lot of those, I suspect, protests that were happening in the city centre had very little to do with COVID, and perhaps had an awful lot more to do with underlying political grievances that those groups had or have.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good point to offer. My background being in finance, I said before we talked here that I had a slightly different perspective on expertise, because I mean, when you study finance, you go to university, you spend 3 or 4 years, and you learn about diversification and capital asset pricing model and all this stuff, and you go into the workplace, and then you find out that nobody uses them at all. And you find out that, because you're a young graduate, you're all eager and excited to use all the things that you've learned in college, and then you get into work and they're like, yeah, no, forget it. It's none of that's relevant at all. We didn't hire you because you knew that stuff. We're actually going to teach you now how to do it properly. And there is this not a rivalry. There's a certain kind of disdain for people who are overly credentialed, almost. I don't want to say disdain for people or it's disdain for not the people, but the idea that having more and more qualifications is better, or that it demonstrates more expertise in finance. Because in financial markets, at the end of the day, the metric is, if you're going into a market and you are trading in the equity market, the fixed income, whatever it is, it's very clear whether you've done well or not. You have a benchmark that you have to perform. If you make more money, then you did well. Good for you. If you make less money, then you did bad, and you just lost. Everybody's taking their money out of your fund and you're gone. And when you do that, when you have that over time, what you have is a kind of a sort of a natural selection. And you can look at someone's returns like Warren Buffett or George Soros, whoever, you want to, the kind of the big names, and you can look at their returns over time, and you can compare them to the equity market, and you can compare them to other investment managers. And it's pretty clear who's got statistical significance. Like, it's transparent. It is quite transparent. They could be cheating. That's always a possibility. There are plenty of people out there cheating. But over time, if you can do it over decades, you've got to say, well, that guy knows what he's talking about. And it really doesn't matter if he's got a degree from this place, that place. If he's got no degree at all, if he's reading tea leaves and he's somehow coming out with these conclusions, but he's making profit in the long run, there's something very sort of, the alignment there. Oh God, I don't want to talk about ethical alignment in finance and say that it's the ethical alignment's really good, but within the market structure, that's how you tell expertise, and how that relates back to NEFIT and to where we are now is that I think a lot of people, I'm not sure they trusted NEFIT in March and April so much as they accepted NEFIT. They're like, okay, you're the guys, you're the CMO, you've done the research, you're all these guys, okay, we'll do it your way. And the months go by, May.
Yeah. I kind of see what you're talking about. I would have said that at the early stages was quite we don't know where to turn. So it's like the fire brigade coming to put out your home on fire. It's like, you're not going to ask them where they went to do their training. The objective is, will they stop your house from burning down? And you trust them, but it's fear-based, right? You're not going to ask a lot of questions at that point. As things continue, you're going to start going, what's going on here now? I hear your point, and without getting into my view on how the financial world works, because I don't know an awful lot about it, except the objective for many is to make money, and that's okay. That's one of the rules. It's like, I hear what you're talking about as practice-based expertise. that's relevant to the field. And I would say that for most medics, theirs is also a practice-based expertise, except that the outcomes are perhaps more complex. So like it's, you quote Spock, the saving of the one versus the saving of the many kind of level of complexity, that there are many moving parts. There's issues of inequality of access, as well as inequality of outcome. So we've seen that with COVID for sure. So I suppose there's a level of complexity that perhaps the more Darwinistic market approach may allow to kind of be washed out, and where with these other ones, there's supposed more professions that are more caring about, or caring for rather than caring about, that they have to be more aware of those complexities, because everyone has to be taken care of. So the schools system is another one that you could look at as a parallel. So you could quite easily construct a narrative where a successful expert teacher was one who was able to hothouse the top 10%, so they go on and make the money that would provide the services for everyone else in the society. But the question is that whether they're really experts if the remaining 90% feel inadequate. So what I'm trying to in a roundabout way say is the nature of practice-based expertise depends on what outcomes you're looking at, and that those outcomes can be very, very complex. But I completely take the point that you're raising, which is that how people look at expert views is going to be completely based on where they come from and the world that they live in and work in, and that perhaps more needs to be done by groups such as NEFIT or other groups to demonstrate their expertise in a way that isn't oppressive, to talk about the basis of it.
Yeah, I think, I suppose the angle I was, first of all, the point you're making about it being, like what I was saying, it's so simple in financial markets. It's like, yeah, it is. It's much more simple to see whether a manager did well or did badly, whereas this is much more complex, much more nebulous. We don't even know what the kind of the outcomes are. And I guess what I was trying to get to is that if you're just someone who's trying to understand it, you're a regular citizen, you have no great expertise in anything, you're trying to understand this, and you're looking at what you're hearing stuff from, whether it's NEFIT or policymakers. Don't want to make it just about NEFIT, but you're hearing over and over again, oh, we need to do this, we need to wash our hands more, we need to stay vigilant, we need to do yada yada. And you're like, well, it's been 6, 7, 8 months now. At some point, why is the problem not solved? Shouldn't the problem be solved? If we're doing, for the most part, and we were for a long time, doing everything that you say we're doing, and the problem still isn't solved, for me, that is the point for a lot of people where the trust starts breaking down, where people start asking questions, where people start talking about a plandemic. And I don't think it's because they believe in conspiracy theories necessarily, but I think there's a lot of just ordinary people who are trying to make sense of this, who don't have the expertise, but they kind of have a sense themselves that they know, well, I feel like I've done my bit,
Yeah.
How is it that if I've done my bit?
Absolutely. Are we all in it together, And that's very, very reasonable. Because as I said in the article, people are going to say, well, I was able to suspend the reality that I have a job that requires me leaving my home for a couple of weeks. That's no problem, because we didn't really know what the outcome was going to be. And if we could get to the summer, maybe it would all go away. And it hasn't, and perhaps this is the result of short-term thinking. And it's not that anyone's been at fault. It's just that we've all been so caught by the immediacy of this issue, that, we can only really see a couple of weeks ahead of us. And that's very disconcerting. For us all. And I suppose the only thing I would take hope is that we have in Ireland fantastic societal cohesion on the whole. We are doing really well here. As challenging as it is for anyone who's lost their job or has indeed lost or someone who's lost their life in their family, we're doing relatively well. We could be doing an awful lot better, but I think an awful lot of what we've done well has been down to the fact that how good our societal cohesion has been, in terms of us being able to kind of say we're trying our best to be in it here together. But I think that's where leadership really has to help in order for us to keep going. It's just like, like if the initial burst was something that we were all learning how to do, and now we're finished the second lockdown, what's going to happen if we have a third one or a fourth one? As somebody wrote in the paper just this morning, can Micheál Martin continue to come down the stairs of the government building and have that speech with us? You know, with the quote from a poem or something like that. It's like, can that continue to work? And they weren't saying absolutely it cannot. It was just like, let's not be naive and assume that it will. We should have more complex ways of looking at this that are perhaps more medium term.
I guess so. That was I was going to bring up to kind of. I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I guess we're sort of coming to a kind of a.
No, it's been good. It's been good. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. No, it's been therapy for me as well, to be able to say these things and to have a conversation about it and to get feedback on the ideas and to get a different perspective on it, which would be great. But I guess I'd ask, first of all, from your perspective, I'll let you have the last word. I'll say from my perspective, I think that the things that we need to do going forward, you know, if we think about practical changes or philosophical changes that we could make that would represent progress from where we are now to where we want to be, firstly in the context of COVID, but as your article suggested, also as a nation, you know, Ireland in general, for the other challenges that we're going to have for the future. For me, and I'll just list these because we don't want to open them up again. I think one is within media, we need to have a longer term perspective on our problems, is that it's very difficult to solve long-term problems when, you know, media, whether it's mainstream or social media or whatever else, has a perspective of, you know, measured in weeks. You know, it's going to be very difficult to solve long-term problems, and constantly trying to pull ourselves out of the short term, away from, you know, the immediate urgent issue and back to the long term, the fundamental problems that need to be solved. I think that's one thing, and that's something that we can do ourselves by asking ourselves, okay, is this article about the short term, or is it about the long term? Is it about what's happening today, or is it about solving our problems? And to constantly ask ourselves that question, just have it in our head and to be conscious of it. I think that's one point. And then the second one is related to what you said about mistakes, recognizing mistakes being a strength. And then similarly, because I think it's the same thing as what I'm saying about, you know, about markets and about, you know, if you trade, you do well. If you do well, you get rewarded. If you do badly, you get, I suppose, not punished is the wrong word. I don't want to use that, but you get that feedback. You get that feedback that you made a mistake. You know, if you make an investment and it goes badly, there's a reason why. And that's an opportunity for you to learn something that you didn't know before. And if we had more of a culture, and this is a much more metaphysical, much bigger topic, but if we had more of a culture where making a mistake is okay and admitting that you made a mistake is okay. And the important thing is always that you learn from the mistake, or that you can show that you've learned from the mistake. When you have a culture like that, and you have that amongst, not just amongst the population, but amongst policymakers, then we can start making those little incremental improvements in the same way that, you know, we can evolve, I guess, because it's kind of, it's all natural selection and skin in the game to me. So yeah, they'd be my 2 points. So I'd throw it to you. Where do you see us now, and where would you like to see us in the coming weeks and months?
Well, I'd like to see us all vaccinated. So that'd be one thing, which would be very practical for us all. Like, I suppose, like you, I just want to go back to my normal job, and I very much want to see my friends and family, and I miss them. So I suppose recognizing the vulnerability that we all have at the moment is important. We could all be more empathic, that we could all be kinder to one another at the moment. I think that's something we can each choose to do. I also think that the importance of a climate of trust is something that's worth thinking about. So much of the populist rhetoric in recent years has been about creating a climate of distrust. And whilst it is perhaps easier to destroy things rather than to build, it's not impossible for us to build a climate of trust. And that can be about naming it. It can be about saying that, you know, developing trust in ourselves, our experts, our doctors, our whomever is worth doing, and that we can call out the good stuff and reward it and say how well it's going, and perhaps, you know, as you said, learn from our mistakes, but do so in a more public, in a more humble way. You know, recognize that none of us has the solution to living or getting beyond COVID on our own, and that we have to work with others in a way that we listen as well as share our points. So I think that's very much worth doing. creating that climate of trust. And if that is a legacy of how we have handled COVID, it's perhaps one that, instead of looking back and saying, God, that was really messy and we said things and did things that we regret, it might be that we'd be able to look back on this time with a sense of pride and a justified pride, and saying, gosh, we held ourselves well, we acted with integrity, and we looked after as many vulnerable people as we were able to humanly do.
There's a phrase, never let a crisis go to waste, which is kind of in my head the whole time.
Yeah.
What can we take
Absolutely.
from this?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, Shane Bergin, Assistant Professor of Science Education, UCD, thanks for your time, and thanks everybody for watching. Cheers.
Thanks, Dermot.